Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Elaine Gross. I'm Executive Director for an organization called Sustainable America, which is the focus of our press conference today. And I'd like my colleagues to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started, just so you know who's here.
My name is Mark Ritchie. I'm President of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and I was a founder of Sustainable America and serve as the co-chair of the National Board for Sustainable America.
My name is Pamela Spar. I'm an economist on the national staff of the United Methodist Church in the Women's Division, responsible for the Office of Environmental Justice. I'm also a board member of Sustainable America.
Sustainable America is a national organization with headquarters in New York City. We have 80 organizational members who, with the national office, are promoting public policies and private practices that promote sustainable development. The reason why we're here this week at the WTO events is because, as supporters of sustainable development, we are in favor of a sort of democratic development model where citizens shape the economy. And the WTO is an unaccountable organization that operates in secrecy and usurps the power of people and our elected officials. Sustainable development seeks to achieve the greatest good for people and the environment, and the WTO seeks primarily to benefit transnational corporations without regard for either ordinary people or the environment. Sustainable development seeks to create diverse and vibrant regional local economies, and the WTO's globalization policies are contributing to a significant destruction of local economies in many places. And finally, sustainable development seeks to nurture things like sustainable businesses. That is, businesses that are environment friendly, that treat their workers like partners and pay living wages, that are rooted in communities. And of course, the WTO agreements are really interested in making markets for transnational corporations across the planet. What we're focusing on today, this afternoon, we have a workshop that is looking at the government procurement agreement, which is one of the agreements of the WTO. And we have a dialogue between NGOs from the North and South to discuss this agreement and its implications for our work and for our economies. As you know, governments can either stimulate or suppress sustainable development through their purchasing policies. Some governments have very large budgets for purchasing. And we know that in 48 states, there are procurement policies with environmental preferences. In 43 states, there are either Buy America or Buy Local kinds of policies. In 19 states, there are human rights preferences, and we'll talk in a minute about the Massachusetts Burma law case, which is one of the more famous recent issues around human rights preferences. And in Seattle and in other locales in Washington, as well as other places, there are minority, women, and veteran preferences, and there are also small business preferences. I should also state that Washington State has the environmental preferences as well. So the government procurement agreement limits the purchasing and economic development policies by forbidding just these types of policies that I've just referred to. Currently, there are 25 national governments in 37 U.S. states that are covered under the GPA. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute in terms of where we're going, but that's our current situation. In terms of specific implications of the government procurement agreement, people that are trying to promote, as I mentioned, sustainable businesses, certain kinds of economic and community development activities will be thwarted by the government procurement agreement. If you feel that there is a certain constituency or certain communities, urban blighted areas, for example, and you wish to have special preferences for those areas, there is a possibility that your activities will be ruled illegal under the government procurement agreement. Mark, I'd like you to continue to talk about some of the other specific implications.
Yes, I wanted to look specifically at the ecological and human health issues, food security. And I think a number of you have perhaps followed over the years developments in the area of eco-labeling, green labeling, and fair trade labeling, where consumers get together with producer groups, develop standards that reflect the kind of ecological, social, and community values, and then they begin to develop accreditation, certification, and labeling, consumer labeling schemes to be able to communicate that so that producers are receiving a fair price, the production process is protecting the environment, and then consumers can know how to find that product and how to spend their dollars in a way that supports that kind of behavior. What we found in many of these labeling initiatives is that a crucial element for the success of the initiative is the involvement of government agencies, local, state, federal, of private institutions, universities, colleges, hospitals, schools, and of other institutions in our society like churches and other large purchasing institutions, that the procurement process becomes critical to building enough volume within this larger market economy to be able to make the kind of consumer choice and preference that we want consumer labeling to provide us to make that work. So government procurement not only is a critical element in and of itself, the notion that our tax dollars should be used in ways that we want and should support the values that we want, but government procurement is also very important for reaching the broader retail and wholesale consumer market. Without the right to have government procurement decisions, be they about environment or social justice or whatever it may be, without the right to do that, many of the consumer labeling schemes which are aimed at really influencing the entire marketplace really are not feasible and possible. Many companies know this, particularly those who've been attacking eco-labels and social labels very directly through their literature, through their political process. They also know what we know, that procurement is critical to the survival and growth and well-being of labeling, of eco-labeling in particular, and they are a part of the coalition pushing to bring procurement under the WTO and then secondarily to use it to defeat these initiatives. Many countries have said no to bringing procurement under further under the WTO, and so the United States government has a very specific strategy. Their strategy is to call only for what they call transparency. They use a word that makes it sound very democratic, very friendly. What they mean is they want each country to list very specifically their procurement and their procurement operations. The goal of the United States, and this has been stated publicly, this is not something that's a secret, is that once you have countries making a list, you have started down the road under which those procurement laws can then be brought under the WTO disciplines in the end. In other words, countries who believe that the WTO should not be involved in procurement, many of them are aware of this trick or this strategy, whatever word you'd like to use, and so they're resisting it. But the United States makes it sound very compelling. The United States government makes it sound very democratic. We want to be transparent. In our briefing yesterday, they kept talking about how this can help fight corruption and who's against fighting corruption. But in fact, they use the word, it is the camel's nose under the tent, so that's how they want to bring procurement. Sometimes these issues are portrayed as sort of north-south issues, and that it's just the South governments who are upset and opposed to this U.S. initiative. But Sustainable America, as a national organization in the United States, is taking a very strong stand with many allies and saying that government procurement is an issue in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our schools and churches, right here and now in the North, in this country. And we're very happy that we're able to come together here in Seattle with our allies and colleagues who are also concerned about these issues of environment and health and food security, and to say no to the attempt by the United States to bring procurement under the WTO, and say yes to the expanded use of procurement to support eco-labeling, social labeling, and to support a marketplace that values the values that we share.
Pam, would you like to talk about some of the other implications, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Elaine. I'd like to focus my comments on two different areas in terms of the implications of the GPA. The first is social, environmental, and economic justice, and then I'd like to make a few comments about human and worker rights. In terms of looking at what would be threatened or what is already threatened in terms of the GPA, are the ability of various jurisdictions to set standards in terms of the environmental track record of companies that they do business with. For example, in encouraging companies or selecting companies that do not engage in environmental racism in terms of disproportionately polluting communities of color in which they do business in terms of setting up operations. Or actually, and conversely, through government procurement, we can also encourage companies to do business in distressed neighborhoods that need an infusion of capital and business. And the incentives that can be given under procurement are actually threatened by the GPA in terms of promoting local community economic development. Looking at human and worker rights, as you may know, some government procurement agreements now restrictions require companies either to be unionized or at least to pay certain forms of locally determined living or just wages. These are threatened by the GPA. Also threatened are selective purchasing from countries based on the human rights and labor conditions in those countries in terms of businesses doing business there. For example, it threatens the ability of states to deal with issues of forced labor, child labor, or sweatshop labor, which can be made illegal under the GPA. The state of Massachusetts, for example, in terms of human rights provisions, set procurement standards which would discourage businesses from doing business in Burma because of the human rights conditions in Burma. As you know, a coalition of multinational corporations threatened and successfully sued the state of Massachusetts, saying that the state of Massachusetts had no right or authority to tell those businesses where or where not they could do business. And thankfully, the Supreme Court earlier this week agreed to hear the case, which is an incredible victory, because the case, two prior jurisdictions actually, the judges settled in favor of the coalition of multinational corporations. Sustainable America was one of the NGOs that became party to the amicus brief to the Supreme Court. The Women's Division of the United Methodist Church also was party to the Supreme Court, and so finally we now have another opportunity to raise these questions about the threat to our laws, both at the national and subnational level, that the GPA offers. Another example in terms of the threats to foreign policy, as many of you, given your ages, will know and have lived through the anti-apartheid movement in terms of South Africa. And as you're, I'm sure, very well aware, a lot of cities and states use their purchasing ability to encourage disinvestment from South Africa. Those kinds of laws, which were not challenged then in terms of from multinational corporations, could be challenged now successfully under the WTO. I think that's it for now. Elaine, would you like to take over?
Let me just say a few other things about how this fits into Sustainable America's broader agenda. I mentioned that we are a membership organization, that we have some 80 organizational members working together. And so our presence here this week is not a one-stop shop. The government procurement campaign is part of our broader agenda of promoting sustainable businesses, both helping to create new businesses and supporting existing businesses through technical assistance, as well as the policies that nurture those kinds of enterprises. We also have a recent publication, which is a tool for looking at environment-friendly taxes. As some of you may know, you can tax the environmental bads, such as pollution or the depletion of natural resources, etc., and you can lessen the taxes on things which are considered good, which would be labor taxes, things of that nature. So there are some tools that we produce for our members. We are also helping to what we call fight dumb growth. There is a language which is very common now called the sort of smart growth movement. And we won't go into all the details of how sometimes that is really not very, doesn't go very far in actually supporting sustainable development. Sometimes it is a little bit of a sham, you might say. But we are looking closely at those things related to both equity as well as land use, and the kind of growth which doesn't help the people in our communities, etc. So along with this campaign related to the government procurement agreement, which we call our buying power project, Our Money, Our Values, we have a proactive initiative. We're not just against the government procurement agreement or against any other variety of national or international policies, but we are creating in our communities positive examples demonstrating that you can do it differently. And that's our approach to our work generally, is to try to demonstrate through our local work alternatives to the sort of destructive consumption and production patterns that are prevalent in this country and across the globe at this point. Mark, do you have any final comments?
I want to make sure we get time for questions and discussions, but I want to say that the thing about Sustainable America being here this week is that we remember and are reminded of all of our allies from around the planet, some of you in the room, but that so many people around the entire planet are concerned about the same issues, face the same struggles, perhaps different circumstances, of course, but something about the WTO's greediness, the WTO's sort of willingness to try to take so much power and so much authority has then set off a gigantic reaction from around the world. And so in a way, we've been brought together around this event by a quite negative force, but I think it's a possibility to turn it into a very positive force so that globally we can begin to pursue some similar ideas, exchange strategies, and just try to go forward with building a fundamentally sustainably oriented economy, communities, neighborhoods, families, workplaces, and social organizations. And I'm very happy that you could come and participate in this briefing, and want to move to questions.
Are there any questions?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
You can't see me over here.
Okay.
But if you want to go first, that's fine.
No, go ahead.
I'm a little bit lost on the government procurement issue. Are they doing something new on it, or is it the realization of what they've already done?
We're talking about what they've already done,
Exactly.
the existing agreement.
No, I wanted to make sure, because it's so obvious that they already did it, but you know how it takes forever for the population to find out that they've been done to.
That's
I
right.
did actually testify against that issue in '94 before the committee, the House committee that does the Forest Service budget. I said, you've got an interior appropriations right here, Buy America clause. That is GATT illegal. I mean, it's so obviously GATT illegal.
Let me just repeat the question for our taping purposes. The question was, are we talking about things that already exist or things that they're planning to do? And the short answer to that is that this already exists. There are a lot of people in the broader public that's not aware of this particular agreement. You know, it sounds kind of dry and not that interesting. And also, a lot of people aren't aware that even though it doesn't apply to all of the member nations right now, that, as Mark was alluding to earlier, this is on a track to really have all nations accountable under these GPA regulations. And it was.
It doesn't apply to all member nations, because it specifically said members shall specify technical regulations based on product requirements in terms of performance rather than design or descriptive characteristics.
The question was, why doesn't it apply to all? It happens to be an agreement where the nations had to sign on in effect,
It's called a plurilateral agreement, and
as
so
opposed to,
Nations didn't sign on to it.
not yet.
that's right.
But,
Thank you.
but the problem is the negative effects already we experience. It doesn't take all 143 countries or whatever for us to begin to experience the harmful consequences, because actually the major economies of the world have already signed on to the agreement.
And it's also unusual in that it has an opening for state governments, and I believe also cities, and a large number of state governments in the United States signed on, well, I think without really thinking about it.
The
And
United States then signed on to the agreement on technical barriers to trade from '94?
now this is different. We're talking about the government procurement agreement, which is a separate agreement from
But
the...
it seemed to me that, unless it was just that I was jumping to the conclusion that they hoped us to jump to, it seems to me that when they created this gap thing, that they had in mind of burning us on this back then by saying performance rather than design or descriptive. And descriptive is child labor, made in the USA, you know, eco.
Yeah, well,
That's right.
and the things you're referring to, their intention was to have that apply to all kinds of commerce. But government procurement is a separate category. It's a separate agreement within the family of agreements of the WTO, and it has provisions for signing on by state or sub-federal units of government, which include city and municipal units of government, state governments, etc.
So not everyone had given it up before.
Right.
That's
Thank
right.
you. Thanks a lot.
Another question here?
Yeah,
You identify yourself, please?
yeah, sure. My name's Colin Hines. I'm from London, the group called Protect the Local Globally. Could you just clarify a little bit more? Sure, they're trying to get more people into an already existing thing, but how does that, given that the cat's already out of the bag, is there something that's coming down from this WTO that's going to make it very much worse? Sorry, I have two.
Yeah.
But what's been the union response, particularly the public sector union response? And secondly, what about small businesses as distinct from the Chamber of Commerce's or GATT WTO preferences?
The first question was, if I have it correctly, what is it particular that's coming down at this WTO related to this? At last night's briefing of the U.S. trade delegation, I asked a question about the government procurement agreement, and they basically said they weren't interested in changing any of the language, the current language of the agreement, that they really wanted to move forward with this transparency strategy. And as Mark indicated, that is really a backdoor way of saying, let's get more people in. You said, you know, the cat's out of the bag, and so wouldn't it make it more difficult, I guess you're implying, to get people to sign on to this? We are certainly hopeful that it would. You know, part of our efforts is to make sure that NGOs in countries that are not yet a party to this agreement, you know, lobby their government so they will not become a party, so that there's more opposition to it. But as far as the U.S. trade delegation is concerned, this is a successful effort which they want to support. Your second question was distinctions between small businesses?
Well, and reactions from the public sector, small business.
Labor unions.
Oh, and labor unions. Well, labor unions are very interested in this. One of the members of our working group on procurement, which we just established earlier this fall, is Dennis Houlihan from AFSCME International. So it is something that the labor unions are also becoming much more aware of.
I think, to be quite frank about it, small business, minority business, women-owned businesses, procurement officers who are working to have affirmative purchasing, all of these sectors in a large part are unaware of this agreement and unaware of the potential implications, and public sector and everyone. It's one of the reasons why Sustainable America decided to take up this seemingly dry subject is that we see the gigantic implications, just like the WTO in general, and we see very little knowledge about it and therefore analysis and mobilization. And it's our role internally within our own country to get busy on that process.
The other thing that I might add that might have some people feel that they don't need to be quite so concerned about it, it does have threshold amounts for both services and products. So if you're, if it's under that threshold amount of what you're buying is under that threshold amount, then it doesn't apply. But again, that's another, we don't take much comfort in any of these kinds of what seem to be exceptions, because the government procurement agreement also states very clearly that you can't have any exceptions. So we shouldn't be complacent with such strong language in place telling us what we can do and can't do in terms of purchasing.
Another question back there.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm from California. I'm interested to know, you mentioned that cities and states are signing on to the government procurement agreement, and is that, if the U.S. is signed on, do cities and states need to opt out of it, or are they automatically signed on? Do they need to sign on individually? I'm interested specifically in local selective purchasing laws, assuming, hoping that the Massachusetts law is upheld and those can continue. How does this government procurement agreement affect local selective purchasing law?
The question was, how does the government procurement agreement affect local purchasing law, and whether or not the United States signing on automatically brought on other subnational governments. The short answer is no. The states had to sign on themselves, even though from some of the research that was done by Robert Stumberg at the Harrison Institute for Public Law, we know that some of the states actually didn't sign on, but their names got put on anyway. Or they might have sent a letter saying that they weren't signing on, and then they got put on. So that, there are some questions even about how the states got, how their names ended up on the list. For this particular agreement, it doesn't cover cities. We do have similar agreement that is between the U.S. and the European Union, which does affect some cities. But again, it's just a sign of the times in terms of the sort of sweeping possibilities of national government, state governments, even city governments, even moving to private institutions if it continues in this direction. So,
I think another aspect also, Elaine, is the chilling effect, not only of what laws already exist, but since you're from California, I believe your governor just recently vetoed a Buy California piece of legislation under fear that that was illegal under the WTO and didn't want to risk any lawsuits. So the other aspect I think that we really have to note is the chilling effect it has on our cities and states already.
Question?
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's been any local resolutions or that kind of thing. In British Columbia, where I'm from, the Richmond School Board, for example, has a Buy Green policy, so they've passed an anti-WTO resolution. And I'm just wondering if there's been similar things happening. The other thing is that the British Columbia government, when it negotiates on these areas, takes along what we call the MASH sector, which represents municipalities, school boards, hospitals, so they're all in the room, and they get to raise this stuff with our federal government, and of course they say no. And that enables them to be fully briefed and basically be at the table. And again, I wonder if there's been initiatives, because I know when the Western Governors Association published that paper on the MEI, it was enormously useful to us in Canada. I'm wondering if some of the things we're doing in Canada could be useful to you as well.
The question was from someone from Canada asking whether or not there have been any local resolutions related to the government procurement agreement, and whether or not, was it MASH you called it?
Yeah, we call it the MASH sector.
MASH sector, which brings along hospitals and schools and municipalities as well to be part of the negotiations, I guess you're saying?
To be briefed.
To be briefed on it, at least. I'm not aware in the U.S. that we have the MASH thing as an organized group. But there may be some places that in fact do bring in those institutions as part of the briefing. In terms of some local resolutions, we've just begun to do a little research on that, and I have heard that there are a few, but they're not many, and we're just collecting the information.
Just to note, though, state and local officials did file their own amicus brief to the Supreme Court with respect to the Massachusetts Burma law case. So I think state and local officials are beginning in the United States to wake up to the threats that the GPA has, and hopefully will, through our efforts, will be exercising some more aggressive public policy stances.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Maybe to Mr. Ritchie, you mentioned that transparency is being used as a means to bring procurement under WTO. Could you explain that a little more detail, please?
Yeah. Over the years watching the GATT and the WTO, I've become to see a series of strategies that are used to maneuver countries to get to agree to a certain thing, particularly watching the U.S. delegation, because I've been on it for a long time. One of the tricks inside the WTO and the GATT is that if you can't get people to agree to a subject or to an outcome, like joining the procurement agreement or something like this, then you try to find a way to be able to come back and fight for that idea at a further point in time. If you can put a word into the final declaration that will come out, then you'll have some ability to negotiate on that word down the road. Well, one particularly effective trick has been to say, now, we don't want to negotiate on procurement and we don't want to make you do anything. All we want is transparency. We want people to list their government procurement laws. But inside the delegation discussion, it's quite clear when they say that their intention is that once you have a country listing its laws, the implication is that those are in violation of the spirit and principles of the WTO, and therefore at some point in time they should be eliminated. At the moment, Canada, Japan, the United States, and Europe issue annual reports criticizing each other's trade policies and pointing out the laws of each other's nations that they believe are GATT illegal, WTO illegal. So the Canadian government lists a long list of U.S. federal, state, and local procurement laws. Europeans do the same. Europeans actually do a better job, and Japan less so. So already now we see the process by which listing procurement laws and implying that they are GATT illegal are part of a process of trying to get those laws eliminated. The U.S. uses the term transparency. They justify it in public by saying this will help reduce corruption. So they're taking a public relations spin to this idea, which they intend at some point to then lead to the elimination of those laws that are listed, which initially the listing was just an exercise in transparency.
But you say that the listing sets the implication
that they're illegal under WTO.
That it's illegal.
Yeah.
Well, implication is a very, very broad term. That is there anything specifically that is established, at least in terms of precedents, that a mere listing?
The Burma case is the first precedent that we know that we have in our hand, which was a procurement law, in this case an investment and procurement law, which was provocative enough that the European Union, which is the only force really big enough to challenge a law, came forward. There was a U.S. challenge of Japanese supercomputer procurement, which... Yeah.
What was the listing in the Burma case that led to the raising of the matter of WTO?
Does somebody want to talk about the Burma case very specifically?
I didn't know it was listed.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the listing per se.
Was the question on the listing? Yeah, no, this is You know, they use this technique in other areas. They use this technique in the area of sanitary, phytosanitary laws, on customs procedures. It's this whole process of listing your laws or your procedures is well known in the GATT world as a kind of a, what the U.S. says in public, a nose under the tent for eventually negotiating on procurement overall, with the goal being eliminated.
Just to go back
Yeah.
for the step.
Yeah.
That is, what is the circumstances that would lead to the particular country listing?
If they had a law, the question is what would be the circumstances under which would lead a country to list? If in this negotiation, the next round, if it happens, there is an agreement at the end of the round that says all countries will list their government procurement laws, procedures, and regulations, state, federal, and all sub-federal units, which in the U.S. includes tribal governments, etc., then they would be required, and they would have a date by 2005, or they would have a date under which they would have to list them. This was used on agricultural programs in the last round, and they had 2 years to produce their list.
So you're saying that a procurement standard, any procurement standard, could be used as the basis for establishing vulnerability under WTO?
The current strategy of the United States is only to get the WTO to require all members to list procurement laws. Their hope is that that will then start a process that they would then negotiate the elimination of those.
I think it's important to understand that what we're talking about is a tool, is a strategy for moving this government procurement agreement, for expanding its reach beyond the current countries that are now accountable under it. And so once you have the list, it's much easier to point to, oh, well, that state does this, and people begin to challenge that.
Well, to give an example, which is a little ridiculous perhaps, one could have as a procurement standard that a particular item shall meet the good housekeeping seal of approval.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not about standards.
Okay.
Let me clarify. Government procurement says the government, when it spends its money on this item, will take these things into account in the expenditure of its money on this item. That item might be steel for bridges, and in the case of Chicago, it must come from an Illinois steel producing factory. So it's about government procurement. The standards negotiation is a separate one.
It might be helpful to just let me identify the key provisions. I don't know.
We're over the. Well, there'll be somebody beginning to push us. But we also have a workshop.
Yes. We also have a workshop this afternoon, which is at 4 o'clock. It's at the Gethsemane Lutheran Church at 911 Stewart Street. So anyone interested, and we have a...
Should we hand the flyers out?
Yes. We have also created a primer on the government procurement agreement, which might be helpful to pick up. It does try to put into English what the government procurement agreement says. Understandable English.
Maybe we should stop.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good question. It's a sneaky little deal.
You know what? This goes to the heart of what got people so motivated in labor, for example, against multi-level reinvestment, against fast track.
Right.
And he has done a wonderful job over the last 2 years influencing the progressive agenda, shaping policy, and making sure that we have a green city council. Thank you, Todd.
The first thing we're going to do is organize a little bit. No. Is there enough room for anybody else to squeeze in there? So this way we can, because there are some folks way back there and maybe in the other room. So if we try to, we can fit maybe 4 people sitting down. People don't mind sitting on the ground. Okay, that Don Mason's going to take the challenge.
Hey, Don.
Always.
All right, and if someone does come in later, whatever wants to sit down, probably if you want to work 2 spaces down over there. First of all, I want to thank the people in the house, because literally it's not my house. I want to say a few words about that in a few moments. I didn't inherit an inheritance, you can say. But I do want to recognize, first of all, thank all my housemates, and there's at least 1 or 2 here. Nora Leach, along with myself, is the oldest resident here. Not me. Sorry, not to reveal the age here. Sorry about that.
Try that again.
Put my foot in the mouth.
Longest term.
Longest term, right.
Most experienced.
And the person with the smart mouth is the brains behind the organization. That's no Aldrich. There's your hand. He is one of 3 really fine people I have the opportunity to work with my staff. Lisa Herbold, who can't be here, but who's a great person, as well as Frank Vitti, who also is not here. But they're both, we work as a team, and I think that, you know, if I have any success, it's due to the ability of working well with other people in my office. I want to say a couple words quickly just about the house, because so many people come through here and they say, wow, great woodwork. Where do I get it? But also, you know, besides the house, it was built in 1908. It was a mansion. It was built by the person who sold picks and shovels and people going into Alaska to make gold. And this guy did, but it wasn't digging it. And it went through several generations. It was a nunnery at one time. But now it has the honor of being reputation. Remember, the oldest housing collective in the Northwest. It was formed in 1972. The house is owned by literally a 501c3. It's a nonprofit, Evergreen Land Trust, and we've got 5 properties. Each one is run as a collective. And so, and then people always ask me, if you own the house, we say, well, when you live here, you own everything, the problems, whatever. When you go, you don't own it. You know, that's as simple as that. You know, you don't take anything with you, but that's it. But anyhow, so that's a little background. I also want to say that, as was pointed out, I am one of the Greens on the City Council, and you know, I think this year, particularly with the new electeds, and unfortunately Don Mason's here, who's here, not get elected, but I think that nevertheless, with the people we have on the City Council right now, including Judy McCastro, who has soccer.
Yeah, she had to leave.
She had to leave, okay. And are there any other City Council people here? No. Okay. Is that a candidacy?
Don't forget Kurt's here. Kurt's here.
Oh, Kurt also ran. Right. Well, Kurt. I do want to recognize other elected officials. Maggie Fimia back there does a good job. Without her, we would not have had to stick. Or do we have to stick? But I mean, she was the one responsible for almost not getting a stand. Are there anybody else who's elected in your precinct? That's what I don't think anyone. Okay, so future candidate. There we go. In any case, I think we're on the verge of really having an opportunity to pass some, try an old word, but really some progressive legislation. And I think the most important thing, though, really, someone else pointed out earlier, is that once you elect someone to office, it's really critical to keep in touch with them. Don't let them drift away, because it'll happen to everybody. Believe me, it's like you know, lack of sleep. It happens, and so you have to make sure that they hear from you and be open, create a dialogue. Because the most important thing, I think, quite honestly, any elected official can do is ask questions and force bureaucracy to basically explain what they're doing, and often they can't. And therefore, we can convince other people to vote your way. But if you don't have people willing to ask hard questions and go in there and be willing to be on the losing side of the vote, and I've had a few, you know, that's important. And then that's how they'll get the momentum going on. And the latest thing, by the way, regarding the last events, the last couple of days, and I presume many, if not all of you were there, I was in the streets for 6 hours along with Council Member Richard Conlon as well. And I thought, you know, this was the largest demonstration Seattle has ever had. It was, I think, well over 25,000 people. And it was like 40,000, whatever. And
50.
Kurt never lets me down. He's always
for the New York press, 50. Do we hear 60?
Exactly. But we shouldn't let the broken windows and whatever detract from the message that really was what was so prevalent amongst all of us, which is basically that the WTO does not represent a bright future for the world if it's going to go in the direction as it has in the past, that basically corporations making decisions for people. And that message, is actually, Tom Haig was interviewed briefly, and he did say that, if nothing else, WTO is now a household word. It's probably a bad word. So, with that, I'll let Robin come back.
I'm over here.
Okay, and you will introduce Robin?
Yes. Before I introduce Ralph, I also want to recognize a few other people. I want to recognize Maria Kane, who has been our point person in the King County Council on the WTO issue. Working closely with Brian Durdowski, a very green-minded official. The Green Party of Seattle is a local group, but the Green Party is a national and international gathering. We have Green Parties in 80 different countries on 5 different continents. And I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of them, including the Environmental Minister of France, Dominique Fournier, and some of the European parliamentarians. And I just wanted to recognize, I know there's at least 1 or 2 European parliamentarians who are Green Party members, and I wanted to recognize them. So you're one of them? Would you like to say your name?
Francine Bazet. I'm just proud to be Vice President of the Regional Executive of Isle of France. Isle of France is the biggest region in France. It's about 11 million people.
Are there any other French Greens over here? Okay, we got them all. Okay.
Nikki from the European Greens, I think is on her way.
Okay.
I was with her earlier. And I'm the national leader of the Green Party of Canada. So.
I'll stop there because we could introduce like half the room. We're candidates and running for office. And I want to now introduce a man who needs no introduction. Is he back there?
He hasn't left yet.
I saw him last night at the WTO forum, and boy, did he do an incredible job slaying the bunny slayer of Ralph Nader has run as a Green Party presidential candidate in 1996. Some of us, or many of us, are hoping that he will be running again in the year 2000.
We need him bad.
He's a longtime consumer advocate, founded Public Citizen. I've worked closely with his local group, People for Fair Trade, on the WTO issue. I've been working on that for the last 6 months. And what we're going to do is we're going to have Ralph give some remarks, and then we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. So, Ralph Nader.
Thanks very much. Nothing like a quiet fireplace. You've all been to gatherings like this for the major parties. They'll stand up and tell you they have a 10-point plan. We have a 10-point plan. Several things. One is what went on this week in Seattle is an example of a lot of small meetings all over the country, and building, a lot of internet work, a lot of reading, a lot of thinking. And look what happened. These government officials and their corporate allies are not used to this at all. And it really shook them. And it's shaking them now. And it's going back to their home countries. And one reason is that people haven't come out in great numbers for years. And so they assume, wow, if 40, 50,000 people come out, this must represent, a real mobilization of greater numbers who didn't make it to Seattle. And you can see that expert sniffer of the political winds, Bill Clinton. He's stealing some of our phrases. And he cavalierly rejected in 1994 and 95 when he just rammed this thing through Congress under fast track and refused to meet, refused to talk, refused to even read the 500 pages. I'm told he reads a lot of books, pulp novels, and he had a year to read the 500 pages and he didn't do it, and it showed in terms of his lack of understanding or lack of being willing to understand that this is a very serious system of autocratic governance, and we've given up more local, state, federal sovereignty any time in our history. Now that really worries all of us, because how could this have happened if we had a semblance of an alert citizenry? Even just a few hundreds of thousands. Instead there were a few thousand, part of the global trade watch, working and made some of the votes in Congress closer than they thought. But what it teaches us is we have a very fragile democracy, and it's not as deep as we would like to think it is. And we've got to make the issue of democracy in all its manifestations the central contention of politics. That's and the central contention of politics is the distribution of power, which is what it's all about. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? And to what uses are the holders of power putting their power into the lives of people. So this is what, yeah, this is what really I think all our political efforts should be directed to, because giant corporations are on a collision course with American democracy, and we're losing. We're losing in every dimension. The press is more concentrated in the hands of more big conglomerates. Politics is more corrupted than ever by business money. The workplace is more dominated than ever with the weakening of the trade unions and a lack of unionized workers. Our children are being raised increasingly by corporate hucksters instead of their parents who are busy commuting back and forth and going to work. And above all, these companies are now in their inebriated binge of power are trying to restrict our rights to have our day in court. That's so-called tort reform instead of tort deform. And they now have got us signing on the dotted line in all the contracts that we do with HMOs and banks and insurance companies, and take it or leave it. So this is a very serious thing, and none of the major political candidates really ever talk about this. They'll talk about freedom and liberty, but they won't talk about justice. Notice? You ever see a single speech by Ronald Reagan that mentioned the word justice? It's a no-no. They talk about freedom, liberty. There's no freedom and liberty without justice. I thought Cicero's definition of freedom was terrific. He said, freedom is participation in power. That's not a definition that Ronald Reagan or Bush would like. I want to keep it up there in the ethereal stratosphere. In terms of what happened here in '96, Kurt was telling me that the effort was really quite grand in the Seattle area, with relatively few people being mobilized. And whenever I hear that, that's a great optimism, isn't it? If a few people can do what they did, they can multiply their efforts and really get moving. Now this is where, let's set up so just a hypothetical here. How do you get to be a major party in America? You get 1 million people who pledge $25 a year and 50 hours of time, and you've got a major party in America. That's it. Right? So you see, but we grow up thinking, my God, you can never have a major party in America. It's a two-party system. The electoral laws are rigged. You can't get on the ballot, etc. Well, The Libertarians get on 50 ballots. We got far more votes than Libertarians in '96. I was only on 21 states, and I didn't campaign. and the Natural Law Party, they were on 48 state ballots, and they intend to be on 50 state ballots this year. And you do it by, if you don't have the dollars, you have the hours. And if I decide next year to go for the nomination of the Green Party, I'm going to have hour raises. We'll pass out a pledge form, an hour pledge form, and we thank Nick for his hospitality and giving us home. We walk out, and the press said, "Well, how'd you do?" And I said, "Terrific. We've just raised $147,000." Now, although hours won't pay the telephone bill or the copier bill, hours are far, far more effective because you get directly involved. While these fat cats are writing checks, we're involved, we're talking, we're using our time, and therefore using our mind, and therefore developing epicenters of influence with our relatives and friends and co-workers and neighbors. And we develop new greetings, like you come up to, one green comes up to another and say, "Hi, how's your epicenter today?" It's growing, isn't it? And then you see you just start multiplying the efforts just extraordinarily. Like I just bumped into a fellow who was a congressman from Indiana, Jim Johnson. He was a pretty good fellow, and he was there for about 3 terms, and he was defeated. And I said, "Why aren't you running from your district?" Because he thinks the incumbent is terrible and so on. He said, "Well, I can't raise the money." So I talked to a friend of mine up in Connecticut who could run against Nancy Johnson. His name was Bill Curry. He was a state controller and almost won the governorship of Connecticut. "Well, what's your main problem in deciding to run?" "I don't think I can raise enough money. She's already got $1 million in the bank." This is an affliction of futility. We're talking, if you don't have a message that compels people to join with you and to generate the time and energy, you will always measure your prospects by money you raise. And you won't run, as these two people were very good, they're legitimately progressive Democrats. I mean, they're not like, Dodd and Lieberman, hybrids. They would have a good chance of winning, but they don't have confidence in a significant type of campaigning, which is to mobilize people who mobilize people who mobilize people. So people who think of themselves as leaders in order to generate more leaders, not to generate more followers. That's really a good definition. Leadership. And to do that, you have to have a civic self-confidence. Because if you say to yourself, I really would like to do this, but, just one person, 2 persons, 3 persons, you write yourself off, and if thousands of people have the same mindset, they all write themselves off. So basically, no one defeats them, they defeat themselves. Is what it really amounts to. So this whole week in Seattle is really quite extraordinary, the way it's being run. I've done some talk radio today in other parts of the country, and of course, how is the damage and the arrests, and is it really that bad? That's just not quite up to the Bastille. But then you get down to the issues, and people are beginning to sense that this is a looming system of democracy destructing concentration of power. And it's actually a very brilliant conception by corporations. They just end run state capitals and national capitals And if they can't get to national level, they're going to try to get at the WTO. So, what am I trying to convey here? I'm trying to convey that the key, whether it's past reforms like the abolitionists or women's right to vote or civil rights or farmer progressive movements or trade unions, what was key was not only that they had full-time organizers, a lot of these groups, but everyone who adhered to their cause had a level of intense self-confidence and commitment, that they could persuade other people, that they could persist, that they could refuse to be discouraged or depressed. And that's what did it. You know, when you look and see what they went through, it's really unbelievable. I mean, in 6 months, in 1887, in East Texas, farmers organizing against the giant railroads and the banks that were strangling their livelihood, organized 200,000 farmers going door to door. You know, that's not like townhouses. And secured $1 in dues, which is like $35, $40 today, and spread this movement south. And it was basically senators and almost the president, and it was the most basic political reform movement we've had to date. And they had nothing. They had nothing but their land and their grit. And that's the use of history. The great use of history is you really say to yourself, when you catch yourself saying, gee, the odds are overwhelming. How can you take on these giants? And who am I anyway? When you read what your predecessors did, then something happens to you and you